Okay, so I'm going to chat a little bit with you today about how we come up with the ideas for our stories and how we shape sort of a vague idea into a data story. But before I really dove into that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my role at the Pudding. So we're a small team. There's only 8 of us, and every one of us can do basically all of the same tasks. We just sort of shift your primary focus a little bit depending on who you are and where your skill set lies. So, ooh, keyboard does not change my slides. There we go. Okay, so my role is technically called senior journalist engineer, and I'm gonna like pause right here and say that this is a job title that we 100% made up because we realized that there wasn't really a good title for what it is we do. So we went around and around for a long time trying to decide what we should call ourselves and landed on journalist engineer. And basically what it means, the senior part just means I've been here a while and I can like do things and make stories independently, and I can work with a team of people and lead a project. So kind of like vague leadership skills. The journalist part is probably pretty self-explanatory. It means that I can come up with story ideas, I can do research and check sources, I can write the story itself and come up with a good structure for how to tell a story. I can do interviews. I don't do them very often, but basically all of the things that a journalist would do is sort of rolled into my role at the Pudding as well. The engineer part is more software engineer than like mechanical engineer or something physical, but we do make a lot of things that tend to be like digital things. And this is where my personal strengths lie. So I do a lot of data collection, data cleaning, data analysis. I do a lot of front end web development, which if you're not familiar with how like websites are made, it's basically the process of like making a website look like a website. Like you have to build the structure and then you like make it look pretty and everything goes in the right place and you make sure it works on desktop and mobile. And all of these sort of minute little details go into our work of being engineers. The part we weren't able to fit into this title because it already was kind of convoluted is this idea of design. And that is coming up with like the best way to present an idea. Some of it comes down to things like color and typography. Some of it comes down to choosing the right chart type and knowing how people interpret different shapes and how people interpret information when it's presented visually. So that's also a huge part of my job that's not really rolled into the title, but is worth noting. Now, the reason I kind of went through what my day-to-day job looks like is because I did not train specifically to be a journalist or an engineer. I've actually never taken a formal journalism or computer science class ever. I sort of famously amongst my friends, when I was in high school, I was on our robotics team, and I did a little bit of front-end web development for that team, and the small group of students that was part of the programming team for our like larger robotics team, they were like programming the robot, tried to get me to join them. And I said to them, I don't need to learn how to code. I'm going to be a marine biologist. Like that was my stance, was like, why would I need to learn to code? That's not like my journey. I was really wrong, obviously, not just because I ended up switching careers, but because it turns out scientists actually code a lot. So I did become a marine biologist for a while. I went to college and grad school, and I learned a lot about how to become a scientist. And, I did work with animals. So there's a sea turtle we were rehabilitating in this picture on the left. Picture on the right is a seal we were applying a dive tag to that was recording how long it was spending underwater. He looks really grumpy. I promise you he was 100% okay. But I did this sort of work. The working with animals part that is like cool to take pictures of was maybe about like 3% of my job though. Most of my time as a like scientist, either in academia or I actually worked at an aquarium for a while, was behind the scenes. I was at a computer, I was typing and doing research and learning to read scientific articles and learning to collect and analyze data using code, which I thought I wasn't going to have to do, but I did, and learning how to communicate complex scientific information to large audiences, whether that was fellow scientists or tour groups, or when I was working at an aquarium, I was actually at Disney World, and Disney World is full of children. So I had to explain, like, you know, complex scientific research we were doing to like toddlers. And so I started building a lot of these other skills, and that's really where I spent a lot of my time. And so when I decided to pursue a new career, and I can more than happy to get into the reasons behind that if you're interested, but in short, I was looking for something a little bit more stable that would allow me to consistently pay my bills. I decided to go for something that would allow me to keep doing those things. So there actually was like a lot of overlap between this sort of data journalism, journalist engineer role that I hold now and my job in marine biology. And, the one big thing I lose, of course, is like the daily working with animals, and everyone's like, do you miss the animals? And like, yeah, that was fun. But like I said, that was a very small part of my actual day-to-day work. The biggest things that have changed for me are really that now I have a much larger audience because I can just put things on the internet, and that the turnaround is much faster. And what I mean by that is when you're like an academic scientist, you are working on projects that take months and sometimes years before you finish one. And when you're working in the journalism industry, some people do like breaking news and they're like out the next day. Our stuff usually takes a matter of weeks. So it's still pretty slow for like standard journalism, but compared to like academic work, this was very fast for me to like turn things around in a few weeks. So this like quicker turnaround part was the hardest part of my career transition. And I maintain that this is like still one of the hardest things for me to do. And that's because instead of coming up with a new idea for a new study once a year, I have to come up with 3 ideas to share with my team like once a month. So it's a much like more steady cycle of ideas. And so when I first like switched, I was really stuck on this idea of like, how do you come up with ideas for data stories like consistently? How do you keep coming up with ideas? I like had a few good ones and then I was like, I'm out, like tapped out of ideas, got nothing left. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I come up with story ideas, how the rest of my team does it, and how we sort of shape those into data stories. And I feel like I always need to tell people this. You are creative enough to do this. When I first did this career transition, I definitely had this like moment of, I can't come up with any more ideas because like I'm a scientist, like data person, I'm just not creative enough to like come up with interesting story ideas repeatedly. But like, of course you are. It's just a skill you need to practice. And the more you practice it, the better you get, which actually brings me to my next point, that I'm going to tell you how we come up with ideas, but once you start coming up with them, keep a backlog. This can be like a physical notebook. It can be something on your computer or like the notes app on your phone or whatever you want to do. But like have something handy to just like write down random curiosities as they come up, and try not to filter yourself. Like I had started a lot with like, I would write down an idea and then immediately be like, that's not a good idea, and like erase it. But like hang on to those ideas because sometimes they can be shaped into something much better than you like had in mind in the first place. So if you leave with nothing else today, start a backlog of ideas. I'm going to say it again later. This has just been the biggest thing for me personally. And my team actually makes our backlog public. So feel free to check it out. You can take those ideas, you can use them yourself. We love it when people take our ideas and run with them. Okay, so in terms of places to come up with ideas, basically the short answer is like anywhere, but I recognize that that's like not at all helpful information. So I tried to come up with places that I actually get ideas from. And one of the biggest ones for me is like debates and arguments that I'm having with people. So these are just like conversations that come up naturally that you find yourself like kind of not like arguing in an aggressive, like mean way, but kind of just like debating the premise of the idea with somebody. So for instance, the first story I ever published with the pudding was around this idea of whether there are baby booms after things like blizzards or hurricanes, or like the Red Sox won the World Series or something. And so now there's just this like deep idea for some reason that like, oh no, there's a blizzard and everybody was stuck inside for 3 days. There's going to be like a ton of babies born 9 months from now. Also, I should know I grew up in Connecticut. So like anytime there was a blizzard, that was like the thing people were talking about. And I realized that I'd never seen anybody actually explore that idea. Like there must be a way to know if that's true or if that's just like a weird anecdote we talk about. So I did explore it, and generally the answer is probably not, but it's still, kind of a fun thing to talk about. This is one of my favorite things I've ever worked on because this is an argument I get in with people all the time. And it basically is about how much I hate the pockets in women's jeans, or jeans that are marketed to women, because they are so small and they really like cannot hold a lot at all. And it's very frustrating. And I'm often like giving stuff to my partner to carry for me when we're out and about if I don't want to carry a purse. And so a colleague and I were lamenting over this fact one day, and we just kept talking about it, and we like honestly couldn't stop talking about it. And we would bring it up with people who wear men's jeans, and they were just like, no, that's not a thing. And we were like, oh, but it is a thing, let me show you. So if you ever get that feeling of like you're having a conversation and you want to be like, let me show you, like those are the perfect kind of ideas for this work. So if you have those ideas and you're having one of those kinds of conversations, like write it down. Another is something you know a lot about. These are ideas that like I often overlooked early in my sort of career transition, because I think sometimes when you know a lot about something, you assume everybody knows a lot about that thing. But a lot of times that's like totally not the case. And people are really interested when you start telling them about it. So the second ever story I published with the pudding leaned really heavily into my background in marine biology, talking about where captive dolphins and whales come from. So this was a conversation I had had with guests at an aquarium like hundreds of times. Literally, I've talked to so many people about this. And so to me, it was like everybody knows that in the US, whales and dolphins haven't been captured from the wild and put in aquariums in over 30 years. But then once I started talking to people about that, I realized that like not a lot of people knew that. That was like just information that was super new to people. And they then asked follow-up questions like, well, wait, if they're not coming from the ocean, where are they coming from? How did they get here? What's happening to them now? So if you have one of those ideas about just anything that feels kind of obvious to you because you're very familiar with it, but you start bringing it up to someone else and they kind of lean in and ask more questions, that's a great idea as well. I had this same experience with adopting dogs from shelters. I brought this up to a friend at one point. I adopted a dog from a shelter here in Seattle a number of years ago now, and was talking about the experience with just a friend randomly. And, they were mentioning that they might be interested in adopting a dog. And I was like, oh yeah, you have to be like on it, because shelters in Seattle empty really quickly. And they actually are like constantly importing animals from other states and sometimes other countries, because our shelters and rescues are empty. Like there are not enough adoptable dogs in the area. And I like just thought this was something everybody knew. And then I looked at her face and she was like, I'm sorry, say that again. So this became just like a cool thing that I, talked to this one friend about it, brought it up to a few other people. They also didn't know about this thing. And so it became like the perfect thing for me to really dive into. These types of stories are also perfect for things that are difficult to explain. So things like theories, how something works. We've worked with freelancers before who have made really cool visual explainers of how like sound waves work, or how like predictive text works. I worked with a colleague earlier this year to explain the infinite monkey theorem, which is this idea that if you have an infinite amount of time and an infinite number of monkeys and an infinite number of keyboards, they can eventually write Shakespeare. And so we decided to sort of like turn that theory a little, like change it a little bit and say, what if we have an infinite number of attempts and an infinite number of pianos and how long would it take a computer to like generate a specific tune if they are basically like key mashing. And so we've had this experiment running for a long time. We walk people through like how probability works and how this like theory is formed and why it's interesting. And the computer's been trying to play fast car for like, as of this morning, 2 trillion attempts. So it still hasn't gotten it yet. Theoretically, it'll get there eventually. But yeah, it hasn't gotten there yet. So these kinds of things that are really complicated and involve a lot of like theory and a deep understanding of things like mathematics or things that aren't like necessarily visible. These kinds of stories or this type of journalism works really great for those types of stories. And then things like questions, just general questions you have about the world. So earlier this year, one of my colleagues was wondering, like, what other names can you use the same way that we use Karen to mean like a woman that's usually a white woman of a certain privilege and a certain age? You know, what other names can be like switched out for Karen if we wanted to like change it up? And so we looked at other names for female Karens and other names like what you would call a male Karen. It's David, in case you're interested, and what like future Karens would look like. So this was kind of just like a sort of silly-ish curiosity, but just kind of a weird, fun thing. We also worked with a freelancer a few years ago who was really interested in looking at colorism on the cover of Vogue magazine. So she was wondering about, you know, Vogue and many magazines are talking about how they've been hiring a more diverse group of models lately. And in some ways they have, but have they actually been hiring models of all shades of color? And so we were able to like look at the way that models were being presented on the cover and like how dark their skin tone appeared in each cover and look at how that changed over time and sort of how Vogue has been representing people. So again, kind of a just curiosity about the world and diving deep and exploring that. So random curiosities make excellent stories as well. Okay, so at this point, say you've done those things, you've got your backlog, you've come up with an idea, you're really excited about moving it forward. What do you do now? So at this point, we ask whether your question or idea is unique. Now, just because somebody's done something with it before doesn't necessarily mean that like you have to completely scrap that idea. Sometimes it does, but not always. So the reason we ask this is because often you don't want to like recreate something someone's already done. So for instance, I had an idea a number of years ago of whether I could mathematically calculate if a book version of something was better than the movie. A quick Google search shows a lot of people have already answered this question through data. And I couldn't think of a better way to do it. And so I just put that idea down. It's still in my backlog. Maybe someday I'll come up with a better way to handle it. But for now, it's just sitting there. Alternatively, my team and I had an idea a number of years ago, wondering about how far people in the US have to drive to an abortion clinic. And other people have covered this. This was in, I think, 2017. So some of these articles in this Google search results are newer than that. But at the time that we were writing this, other people had written stories like this, but they were talking mostly about like how far the distance was as the crow flies. So like the distance between like a certain city and the nearest abortion clinic. We were really curious about the aspect of how long it takes to drive there, because sometimes like driving time is very different than like actual distance, just based on geography and you know, road speed limits and things like that. So we felt like our question had a unique angle. We were adding something to that conversation. And so even if people have talked about your idea before, if you can add something to that conversation, that's a perfect thing to move forward. I've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but we kind of check our ideas against against these criteria, whether it will spark debate or sort of create a conversation with people. If you're super excited about it, your audience probably will be too. Like, I don't know if you've ever noticed when people get really excited, but they kind of like light up and they're like really just want to tell you about that thing. If you can communicate that like enthusiasm through a story, if you are that excited about an idea, your audience will be that excited too. And again, kind of, will visuals help communicate your story? If all of these look good, you're on the right track for an idea that can be turned into a data story. Now, this might seem kind of like an obvious thing because I'm talking about data stories here, but this can sometimes trip you up. So whether your question can be answered with data. So here's what I mean. When I was first coming up with this pockets idea of whether women's pockets are smaller, I could have asked a lot of questions about women's pockets. Like, why are they so small? Who's responsible? Where can I find bigger pockets? These are all questions that I could have technically written about, but I can't apply data to those questions. The framing of the question was just a little bit off and not something I can actually answer using data. So if you change the frame a little bit, you can make it a data story. So go with something like, are women's pockets smaller than men's? How much smaller? And how does this affect people who are wearing jeans that are marketed for women? So this like small shift in the framing of the idea and the framing of the question allowed it to be something that can be answered by data. So definitely think about like how you're framing your ideas and your questions if it's something that you are going to want to explore in this way. Obviously, you need to know if the data exists. So sometimes you're able to find data that already exists in the world that perfectly matches your question. There are some really great resources out there of places you can get data that already exists. Kaggle is a great place for custom data sets. Data.world is the same thing. You can get government data sets. The CDC has a lot of great things. Wikipedia has a lot of data and information. So sometimes you can get stuff that is just like custom made, data exists, you are good to go, skip to the next step. Sometimes you have to collect the data yourself. So the Pockets project, my colleague Jan and I literally went to stores and grabbed jeans of the size we needed and the style we needed, and we brought them to dressing rooms and we like literally measured pockets. I wrote a story once on high school dress codes, and I was helped by a couple of assistants, luckily, but spent many weeks literally reading through 400 high school dress code policies. So if you can manually collect data, sometimes that's an option. Be aware that sometimes that's a very time-consuming option. But yeah, try to figure out if your data can be answered, or if your question can be answered with data that already exists, or if you can get it. If not, you may want to revisit your question and come up with something that's a little bit different so that there are data there that can help you. This is kind of the last point I'm going to bring up about like shaping a data story, because after this, you basically are just like good to go and make it. It's really important for us to think about the ethical use of data and the ethical ways to collect data. We talk about this a lot on my team of like, where did this data come from? Who is being included? If this is like a data set that is about people, who is being excluded from this data set? And is there a way we can correct for people that are being excluded if the data set wasn't collected in a way that is representative of the whole country or of your city or whatever you're looking at. Sometimes people are excited that they can just get data and they don't really think about the repercussions of that. We had a project that somebody on our team had been working on a number of years ago using an open data set from the state of Florida that included prisoners' mugshots. And said colleague was planning to include those photos in a story. And we kind of like took a step back and thought about like whether that was okay, whether these people had like consented to have their like photos used in that way and their faces, and whether that is something that we, even though it was available, it's like a totally free and open data set, um, whether that was something that we wanted to continue to perpetuate and to use in the story that we were planning on using it for. And so we ultimately decided not to use that. And we find that sometimes if ideas hit a roadblock here, and ideas can hit a roadblock at any of the points I've already talked about and any number of points after this. But if we hit a roadblock here, like, we are totally fine to just be like, nope, scrap this idea, back to the backlog, find something else. This is like just something we're not willing to budge on. So definitely something I always like to make sure people are aware of when you're shaping data ideas into stories and about to use data in sort of a visual storytelling way. Okay. After this, like I said, it's just a matter of telling your story. It's writing it down. I mean, I say that as if that's not hard. It's obviously a complex and involved process. I just don't have time to get through all of that right now. But yeah, so that's basically how we do it, how I do it, how I've learned to do it since I've switched into this field. And I think the main things you should leave with, again, backlog. It's like been such a game changer, and making me feel like if I'm feeling creatively burnt out, at least I have something I can refer to and pull an idea from there, rather than feeling the pressure to always come up with something new. Um, Ask people about your ideas, get feedback, and ultimately have fun. Like, find things you're excited about and interested in, and those honestly make the best kind of stories.